in Latin, sentio, I feel. I feel in the sense, literally, of senses, the senses, okay? So I feel with my body, whether it be the eyes, whether it be the sense of touch, any other sense. But as you'll see, not surprisingly, the word, or actually the root, is expanded from the senses to a more mental state, such as I feel that that's wrong. Okay, then you get into moral stuff and mental aspects of feeling as an extension of the physical feeling of the senses. So as you'll see, that several words kind of either skirt those two things or jump from one to the next. All right, so you talk about sense, sensory, and sensible. All those are related to each other from sentio, meaning to feel, for the obvious reason that when you talk about one of the five senses, or if you get into the sixth sense, people talk about the sixth sense of whatever, so, such as in the movie, seeing dead people is a kind of another sense, that in that sense. But it's the five we usually talk about of the physical senses of the body, and that's why it's called that. This idea that when you sense something, when you perceive something with the senses, that you're interacting with it in such a way that you do when you feel something, so it affects you in a certain way. And that's why you can say, I feel this or that based on my experiencing it with the senses. Sensory, as you know, the Y at the end means state of or being. So it means being, in the sense of having to do with the senses. So sensory is the adjective referring to the senses. And when something is sensible, it means it can be sensed. And if a sensibility is the state of being able to be sensed or to sense. Okay, so it's the able suffix that we already know about. Okay, so here's that kind of skirting of the physical and the mental that I was referring to. At the top, you have the GIF of the senses, and then this guy, you need to listen to me. No, listen to me. So the idea here is he's trying to sense which one to listen to. And how is he doing it? He's doing it with the mind rather than with the senses per se. He's using the senses to base his decision of who makes more sense to him, right? So just keep in mind that kind of versatility of this root to incorporate both physical and mental stuff. All right, so now we get to the noun having to do with sensing. Okay, so sensory is an adjective. The sensory aspects of something has to do with the senses. When something is sensible, that's another adjective. Now you get into a noun that deals with the senses. And by the way, the word sense itself is a noun, right? So the five senses, each of those is a thing, so the five senses. And now you talk about sensation is also a noun. The ion ending, state of or being, as you know. So you're used to that. So sensation, when you have a sensation, it means you're using your senses. But now, interestingly, that idea is expanded to incorporate a completely different idea. Okay, so you could talk about the adjective sensational in a literal sense of the physical senses. When something is sensational, it has to do with being able to feel something with the senses, but usually not, right? When something is sensational, we usually refer to it in a different way. And here we get into the realm of the idiom, right? I like to make that distinction. So someone from Mars, that's my big example, comes down to Earth and you throw the word sensational at them, they would have no reason whatsoever, and especially the word sensationalism, okay, which I put in there pretty much between you and me to save space so I don't cut off, so I can have the pictures be bigger. That's why I didn't put sensationalism by itself there after that. But anyway, so sensationalism, what is that? That's an idiomatic extension of the meaning of the root, having to do with the senses, to mean, especially in a journalistic context. Let's jump into, I forgot, I was going to have a definition of it, but sensationalism has to do with some, making kind of an exaggerated sense of something. When something is sensational, it means that it affects your senses in a dramatic way. And that's what sensationalistic journalism is, say in the Inquirer or the Star or something like that. The reason why it's called sensationalism, which is just being sensational, which is being, having to do with the senses, it means it strikes your senses in an abrupt way, right? As opposed to something that is fed to you piecemeal, slowly, through reason or through logic or through contemplation. In this idea, it's kind of the opposite of that, sensationalism, when something strikes your senses in an abrupt way. Okay? So that's idiomatic. Someone from Mars wouldn't be able to guess that. And it's an interesting extension of this root. Okay, guys? Now we'll see how versatile this root really is. Now we're moving on, just, again, we're skirting the physical and the mental. When someone is sensitive, you could talk about someone being sensitive in a physical sense, in the sense that their body is very amenable. No, let's see, what's a good word? Very receptive to feeling with the senses. So sensitive in the sense that if you, as in this next picture actually, eat a popsicle too quickly, you have that ice cream headache. That has to do with sensitivity to cold. Okay? But then there's this mental idea of being sensitive in the sense of a mental kind of being sensitive. When something makes you sad, you're especially prone to letting it affect you that way. So here again, we're skirting the physical and the mental in a way that we don't encounter that often with these roots. Usually it's one or the other, and usually weighed more on the side of the mental. But here you can use the word sensitive to mean either the physical or the mental. Okay, so here it says, quick to detect or respond to slight changes, signals, influences when you're sensitive. So yeah, sensitive can refer to not only being prone to being affected by the senses in an extreme way, but also kind of open to subtleties of things. Say you're a really perceptive interpreter of art or something. You're sensitive to the various subtleties of that art. Okay, then there's an extension even further into the mental realm. And here it's purely mental. You see how we just went from sensitive, which incorporates the physical and the mental, depending on the context, to purely mental. So now what are we doing? We're abstracting this root from the physical, where it begins entirely in the physical when you're talking about the senses, and now we're entirely in the mental. So just keep in mind that continuum between purely physical and purely mental. And now we're in purely mental. So sentimental, we know the AL ending is just state of or being. Okay, so being what? And then ment we also had as a suffix. That's another being or state of. So the state of, the state of. The reason for that, don't forget, is is it redundant to have state of? No. Or being? No. Because you're changing a noun into an adjective. Notice that. Sentiment is a noun. It's something, right? And then you turn that something that ends in the suffix that means being into an adjective that ends with a suffix that means being. So you're being piled upon being. And then, by the way, you turn it into another noun, and it could be sentimentalism. The state of sensing. Yeah. So, the little Lego blocks like construction of words using these various elements. Okay, so when someone's sentimental, a verb prompted by feelings of tenderness, sadness, or nostalgia. If you, I guess, pretend this is a movie and you're sitting out and someone's crying to this wedding scene or this after the wedding, the photographs. Someone will be teased or being too sentimental, being too in the brain or in the mind when it comes to feeling for others, this and that. Okay, so again, it's taking that idea of sensing into the purely mental realm. Okay, now we get into kind of very predictable combinations of prefixes with this root that wouldn't require someone from Mars having an idiomatic dictionary of English to understand. When you consent to do something, or you get someone's consent to do something, so in this case it's a verb or a noun, it means you feel with, right? So in this case there is consensus, which is the noun built from consent, between people, between various people, consensus, thinking together, feeling together that something is or isn't the case. Now there's also assent, which I didn't include on this slide because it's so close to consent. It's just add-sent as opposed to, right, as opposed to the con. But they're very close to each other. When you assent to something or consent to something, consent is a little bit more of an emphasis on a number of people that are involved, whereas assent is more often used with just two people, or with yourself, actually, a part of yourself and another part of yourself. But they're really close to each other. Okay, and then pretty much the opposite of assent/consent would be dissent or dissension. And notice that it's not dissensus, right? The way that consent turns into consensus, but dissent turns into dissension, which is a very good illustration. I probably should have put dissension there. It's a pretty good illustration of how seemingly arbitrary these suffixes can be. And also the justification at the beginning of the semester for throwing a bunch of them at you and saying they pretty much equal the same thing. Here's a pretty good illustration of that, right? It might as well be consension, and it might as well be dissensus. They're pretty interchangeable. Okay, so when you dissent, you feel away from something or someone. And then this kid doesn't like veggies, apparently, and so he resents his parents for making him be healthy. And so that means to what? Feel back. Feel again, right? Well, not quite, right? So on paper, means either back or again, but in this case, it kind of means back as in, against, right? To feel against someone, to feel back at them, away in a way. So he's dissenting and he's resentful, if you want to think of it that way. So back would probably work here better than again. So to feel back back from him against who is trying to make him do something. And then to be full of that is resentful, or resentfulness, if you want to turn that into a noun. But more often it would be resentment, and we already learned that ment is the suffix that means being. So being, feeling back. Being, feeling back is resentment. All right? Any questions about this root? Pretty straightforward, an important one, but nothing really tricky about it, I would say. All right. This is going to be a really quick one. Struo in Latin means I build, and the reason why I just put the L there by itself is because it would be redundant, because this is exactly the verb and the alternate verb form of the verb in Latin, meaning to build. Okay, so struo means I build, and structus means having been built. And as you can already guess, the word structure is going to come from structus, and it means having been built, doesn't it? So that would be the first word we look at. So we talk about any kind of building, think about that, building, right? Where does that come from? From the German side, from the Anglo-Saxon side, build, okay? So a structure is something that has been built, whether it be a building or whether it be any kind of structure. It doesn't have to only be a building, anything that you build. Oh, and by the way, the is just a linguistic thing in Latin, meaning about to. It means about to, in this case, about to build. So don't worry about the suffix if I ask on an exam. I would ask for the root. As opposed to this, where I would ask the prefix in the root. When you construct something, it's almost redundant. When you construct something, you're really structing it. And there's no reason whatsoever why in English the word construct isn't just struct. Right? I mean, struct a building. Right? Why isn't it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Okay? Other than the fact that it's emphasizing that you're building by putting things together. So it's kind of underscoring the fact that building consists of putting things to get different elements together into one thing. Okay. And also notice this, that even though structus, and this is just to remind you guys, I want you to really internalize this malleability of these forms. In Latin, structus means having been built, but then you bring that structus into English, and all of a sudden, with the word structure, it means a thing that has been built. But when you say construct, it doesn't mean having been built together. It means building together. So in this case, you're using struct actively as opposed to passively. So the grammar goes out the window. See that? And so that's a good reminder of that. Okay. Do you all get that concept? It's a really, it'll help you to guess what words mean in English. If you don't exaggerate the significance of the grammar of the Latin element that's brought into English. It's very flexible along those lines. Okay, and then construction is just the state of that, or being that. And now, interestingly, and I almost put this separately, because it's a whole other thing. It's a purely mental thing, as opposed to, again, construct skirts the physical and the mental. When you can construct a building or you construct an idea. But when you construe something, that's purely mental. Okay, so you're bringing this root into a purely mental space as opposed to either physical or mental when you talk about construing something. I forget if yeah, good. Okay, so interpret a word or action in a particular way. So say you're looking at literature with someone and you're coming up with insights into the work. That would be construing. That would be interpreting. So what are you doing? How are you construing? First of all, the struo comes through French. Okay, the struo. So the only thing I would ask you for is the root for this, because that's just an ending that is related to the struo in Latin, but it's through French. So the uo turns into just a ue. Okay, but to construe is to what? To build together what? To build together thoughts about what it is you're thinking about and interpreting. Okay, so you're putting thoughts together in order to come up with some kind of conclusion or some kind of interpretation. Okay, you guys? So it's related. It's related etymologically to construct, but here's another example of how, now this is idiomatic, because someone from Mars wouldn't be able to guess that you construct a building, but you construe an interpretation, or you construe things about a work of literature. There's no way that you would be able to guess one or the other. It's seemingly arbitrary. I construe a building. Why not? Right? Because they both come from exactly the same elements. So here's example number 2,600 this semester of the malleability, the flexibility of these forms to be able to make new words out of them. That makes English so unique. Now in German you can build stuff all the time too, but most of the roots and prefixes and suffixes are Germanic rather than incorporating Latin and all kinds of other stuff like we do. Now destroy, now here we go. Why is it not destruct? If you do the opposite of construct a building, if you destroy the building, why is it not destruct the building? And why is it not destroyment? Why is it destruction? What the heck is going on? How did that step get lost? Right? No one knows. It just is. Right? But it's through French, the oi part. Okay? So uo, destruo, is filtered through destroy into English, and it means to destruct. Now, you could say if something self-destructs, but that's different because that's not a transitive verb. You don't destruct something. Something destructs. Okay, and in that sense, that's intransitive, and that's a whole other can of worms. But when you talk about the transitive verb of doing something to something, whether it be to build it or to do the opposite of build it, you're using that verb destroy for some reason, as opposed to destruct. And then you're using the noun destruction rather than doing something with destroy. All right? So good example of how just kind of unpredictable and flexible these elements are. All right, now theoretically what I'm doing here is instructing you guys. Now why would that be? Because I'm building things into your mind. And that's the idea behind instruction, the state of doing that. Okay? I'm putting, for better or worse, I'm actually putting things in your brain that you can take or leave depending on your taste. And that's the idea behind instruction, being an instructor, one who builds things into minds. Isn't that weird? Think about that. I'm instructing you to think about that. I'm putting into your brain, I'm building into your brain the thought of that it might be worth thinking about that. And then I didn't want to do medical. I didn't want to show obstruction of pulmonary artery or something because it's too depressing. But so I'm sticking with a regular old, more kind of abstract idea of obstructing. If there's a sign that obstructs you from going forth, what is it doing? The ob means against or toward originally, and then by extension against. Okay, so against would work here. To build against, right? To put something up to keep you from being able to keep going. So like an obstacle. Obstacle means standing against you. An obstruction means having been built against you. Okay, they're very close to each other. You build something up against someone, or you stand something up against someone. They're very close, obstruction and obstacle. It's good to know where they come from, though. All right. And then this is a little bit long, a few more words than this last root from fund and fus, and I think you'll find this interesting. So fundo in Latin means I pour, like to pour a liquid into a cup. And then having been poured, when something is poured, it's fusus. Having been poured would be the fus. So what do we get from there? When you are confused, you're in the state of having things in your brain poured together. Isn't that interesting? So there's a bunch of discrete thoughts in your brain. And rather than having discretion about these, seeing them as discrete entities, rather than analyzing them, which means holding them up to view one at a time, and in conjunction with each other in an ordered manner. Confusion is the opposite of that. Confusion is when they all run together and you can't distinguish between them. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. To be confused means you need to kind of piece things out, parcel them out, and make sense of them. Make sense of them mentally. Okay? And then confusion is the state of that. And then there's an interesting word that is much less commonly used, at least in the US. I'm not sure about the rest of the English-speaking world, but when something confounds you, or when you confound someone else, or they confound you, what does it mean? It really means confuse. I looked it up in a bunch of different dictionaries, and it's almost always confuse is used as a definition for confound. So they really mean a very similar thing. When someone confounds you, it means it confuses you. It means pour things together in your brain to so that you are what? Confused. Okay, so really they're just about synonyms. That's why I don't have another image for it. All right, when someone is effusive about something, this is the most common way of using the word in English. In the U.S. at least. When someone is effusive about something, the iv is just from Latin evus, meaning another state of thing, poured out of you. So when someone is effusive, it means they're pouring out their hearts for everyone to see. So I praised that person effusively. I praised the baseball team effusively. Or in this case, what is that? Soccer. So this guy is screaming out effusively about how excited he is. Okay, so pouring out his emotions. That's what effusion would be, the state of doing that. Effusion. And then, of course, you can extend that idea to other means of pouring things out, whether it be physical or mental. Effusion of the emotions. Infusion, on the other hand, when someone gives someone a shot, when a doctor gives a person a shot, there's an infusion of whatever it is that is intravenously poured into them, okay? But in this case, it's active. An infusion is an active pouring into the body. So here again, even though the fus in the original Latin means having been poured. The focus here is on actual pouring. So there's another example of the grammar not mattering once the Latin element is imported into the English. Okay. Now here's an interesting kind of, I don't know, aspect to this word is you talk about an infusion, and most people have kind of at least a not positive association with effusion in a medical context. And yet that doesn't stop us from not thinking twice when we see an advertisement like this. Isn't that weird? Usually we avoid these kinds of associations when there's like a kind of ickiness to a word, right? Which I think that most of us don't like the idea of a shot, right? Yet, for whatever reason, maybe because when you go to the doctor, they don't say, okay, I'm going to give you an infusion now. If we were all so used to that word, to where every time we went to a doctor we heard it, most likely the marketing people would not be encouraged to incorporate this word into their ad copy. But since maybe it's not so commonly used that way, then we do use it in this way in terms of, okay, so vitamin C, orange is infused into this, whatever this is, this liquid, or vitamins are infused into it, incorporated into it. And so we don't think twice about it. We don't get icked out by that kind of use of infusion, probably because we don't have a negative enough association with the word infusion in a medical context to prevent that from happening. But even thinking about stuff like that is good for us, to be aware of how words are used in our zeitgeist, or by the zeitgeist. Okay, just a couple more words here. When you refuse something, you pour it back. You pour it away from you. You pour it back from you, right? So you refuse it, you pour it back. So it's being poured toward you. No, thank you. You refuse it. You pour it back in the direction that it came from. Or refuse. Refuse, and you gotta, if you're from Mars, you got to be in on this. You got to have friends on Earth to tell you this. When refuse is used as a verb, obviously it's pronounced refuse with an accent on the root. But when it's used as a noun, meaning trash, meaning the stuff that you pour back away from you into the trash can, then the accent is on the prefix, refuse. Interesting, right? So refuse, refuse. So this is a good example in English of being able to use a root, a Latin root in this case, in a versatile way, not by making different words out of the same combination of elements, but of how you pronounce the darn thing, in a purely phonetic way. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. So refuse or refuse, depending on how it's emphasized, makes it either a noun or a verb, respectively. And then I think this is our last one. When you get a refund from a store for something you bought that you don't want anymore, so now that thing that you're going to get a refund for is, as far as you're concerned, refuse, right? Something that you've refused owning anymore. You get a refund. So now what I want to point out to you guys is in the same way that we kind of called confuse and confound, we consider them to be synonyms built from the same exact elements, from the prefix meaning with, and fuse or fund meaning pour. So with refuse and refund, we're using the exact same elements, but we're expanding the root to mean to be used in two different ways to mean two completely different things. When you refuse something or when you refund something. If I refuse something, I'm in a more generic way pouring it back to someone. But really, I'm also doing that when I refund. When I get a refund, I'm pouring it back to them. I'm refusing to own it anymore, and they are refunding me. They are pouring back the money that I gave them for the thing that I am now refusing. They're pouring it back to me. Okay, so to refund or to refuse. Same elements, completely different words. And in this case, when this transaction we're talking about, I'm on one end of it and they're on the other end. They're refunding and I'm refusing. It's interesting. Okay, and so just make that connection between refuse and refund and confuse and confound. That's kind of the same thing going on there with that root.